So welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to talk about blockchain democracy with author William Magnuson. Please post your questions about our discussion in the chat or in the Q&A boxes, and we will get to them at the end of the program. So I'm going to start with introducing our author. William Magnuson is the associate professor at Texas A&M Law School, where he teaches and writes about corporations, technology, and finance. Prior to joining Texas A&M, he taught law at Harvard, worked as an associate at Sullivan and Cromwell, and served as a journalist in the Rome Bureau of the Washington Post. So welcome. We're so glad to have you. Will you start with telling us a little bit about yourself, the book, and maybe for some of us who don't know what Bitcoin is?
Well, thank you. And let me just begin by thanking you, Jennifer, for hosting me here at the Fort Worth Public Library. I'm not in the Fort Worth Public Library. I'm working from my house tonight, so that's why I have this virtual background. But thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor to be at the Fort Worth Public Library virtually.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, I'm a law professor at Texas A&M Law School, which is located in Fort Worth. I'm originally from Austin, Texas, and I previously worked as a corporate lawyer and also briefly as a journalist. And I think the reason why I was drawn to Bitcoin and blockchain and why I wrote this book was because of those backgrounds, that I was interested both in the sort of the fascinating stories. The journalist in me was drawn to the fascinating stories that were coming out of the world of Bitcoin. And the corporate lawyer in me was interested in what the heck we could do about it from a legal perspective. So what exactly is Bitcoin? Well, I first became interested in it, or first became aware of it in the early 2000 teens. And it was actually all because of an office mate of mine at my law firm who told me that he had just bought this cool new virtual currency and that I needed to get in now before it took off. I didn't listen to him. His other suggestions were that I should switch to an all liquid diet based off of the Soylent drink, and also that I needed to start drinking bulletproof coffee, which, if you don't know, is coffee filled with butter. So I didn't listen to him because of these other outlandish ideas of his, but I should have. I think when he bought it, it was at $200, and today it's at $32,000. So it has experienced a remarkable amount of growth. So what actually is it? What is Bitcoin? It is, at its most basic, just a digital currency. It's a virtual currency. It doesn't exist in the physical world, but it is maintained, and this is what makes it truly unique. It is maintained not by a central bank or a large investment institution. It is maintained entirely by the users themselves. So computers run the program on their laptops and on their hardware, and then they're able to, by doing that, maintain the system itself. So instead of being a monetary system that is run by large institutions, it is run democratically by the users themselves. Blockchain, that's the other key term here, is the technology that underlies Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a virtual currency. Blockchain is the technology that runs it. It is basically just a digital ledger or record. It keeps track of information. You post information on a blockchain through blocks, and it creates a record of all the information that's been uploaded to it. In the case of Bitcoin, it keeps a record of all the times that the Bitcoin changes hands. And so that's the basic, the structure of what Bitcoin is and what blockchain is.
Okay, so the book mentions that the evolution of Bitcoin started around 2008, known as just as the Great Recession was starting. Do you think this type of digital currency would have started without it?
That's a great question. Yeah, so Bitcoin was created by a person that went by the name Satoshi Nakamoto. He is something of a shadowy figure. We don't know who he is. We've never identified him in real life. As far as we know, he is not actually in real life named Satoshi Nakamoto. There is a somewhat hilarious story about a poor person who did have the actual name Satoshi Nakamoto, and who started, as soon as this Bitcoin got launched, he was sort of assailed by journalists for weeks on end until he finally said, I have nothing to do with this. I don't know what you're talking about. So nobody has figured out who this guy is, that Satoshi in real life. He's never come out, but we do know that he's posted online. He's written emails to people. He speaks English quite well, and he is a brilliant programmer. He hasn't been heard of for multiple years now, so we don't know where he is. But Satoshi was the one who invented and created the code that now stands as the underpinnings of Bitcoin. At the same time, he didn't work off of nothing. He did start with an important base. And for that, in order to sort of understand the origins of where Bitcoin came from, it's worthwhile to think about what was going on in the early 1990s. So the origins of Bitcoin and the ideas of virtual currencies came from the early 1990s when the internet was just being developed, right? In the 1990s, a lot of the stuff that we think of as part of the internet landscape just didn't exist, right? There was no Amazon, there was no Facebook. Many of the web browsers that exist today didn't exist then. Safari did not exist. At the same time, there was a group that started thinking about, well, how is this internet going to develop? This group was called the cypherpunks. The cypherpunks was this vibrant community of people who would get together. It was primarily based in Silicon Valley, but they also had worldwide members. And they would get together and they would discuss cryptography and privacy and the internet. And one of their big concerns was, what is the internet going to do to the world? They thought that it seemed pretty clear that the internet was going to open up all these new frontiers of knowledge and communication. But for them, they also worried that it was going to open up all these new frontiers for surveillance, for governments and big institutions to keep track of us and understand what we're doing. And so they were really worried about what the internet would do to people's lives and their freedoms. And so what they started thinking about and started working on was creating a solution to it, creating a way to have an internet that was private and safe and secure. And they focused primarily on cryptography, the idea of keeping things safe and secure using codes. But they also turned to virtual currencies because they realized at the end of the day, they needed to make a currency that would not go through a central system, because if they did have a central system that had to go, that all money had to pass through, that was a way of surveilling people. So they didn't actually end up creating any virtual currencies that lasted to today, but many of their early efforts culminated in what Satoshi Nakamoto created. Now, would Satoshi Nakamoto have created this in the absence of a of the Great Recession? He was certainly working on it around the time that it came about. And I think that the fact that there was this great financial crisis occurring at the same time as he was working on it led to there being more demand and more interest in how money worked and whether we needed to somehow change this money system. And so I think you're right that it was deeply connected with, the rise of Bitcoin was deeply connected with this financial crisis. And I should say, Satoshi Nakamoto, in his first block, the first time that he created some of the Bitcoin, he included in it a little message that said, it was a headline from the Times of London. And it said, "The Chancellor is on the brink of a second bailout of the banks." So he seems to have been quite convinced that there was a connection between all the stuff, all the carnage that was taking place on the financial institutions and his new system for solving it.
Well, and I think it's interesting that the things people were talking about in the beginning of the internet are the same things that we're talking about today, right? Privacy, security, what are people tracking? What are they not tracking? And, you know, I worked for several financial institutions before I became a librarian. And I know we would have people who would deposit cash and be right under that limit of when you're supposed to trigger the report. But a lot of times what they didn't know is they would deposit like that amount of cash a couple of times in a week. And then we would just fill out the report anyway, because we were required to keep track of large cash deposits. And so it automatically triggered us to do that. So for me, I think the digital money without a financial institution there is very interesting to me for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it's easier to hide or keep your money secret, but it also feels to me like it's so much easier for something to go wrong, right? Because we know that many of the financial crashes that we've actually endured are because banks were playing fast and loose with following regulations, right? I mean, that's what happened in 29. It's what happened with the savings and loans. So I just think, for me, it's an interesting concept, but there's still that little security question that,
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% correct. That, yeah, so banks, they fill out these suspicious activity reports. So if you're putting in too much money, or if you're putting in $1 less than too much money, you may still get caught. Bitcoin doesn't have that problem, right? Because there's nobody who controls it. You're not submitting your cash to it every week. It is controlled by all the users. And so that is one of the defining features of it, and one of its defining benefits, but also maybe one of its defining drawbacks, right? Is that because there is no centralized authority figure who can control it, there's nobody who can fix it when things go wrong. So there's this, it's not so hilarious story from the perspective of the victim, but there's somebody in Wales who had bought some Bitcoin very early on. I think he had been running a mine on his computer. One of the ways that you create Bitcoin is that you use your computer's hardware to perform difficult math equations to help maintain the system. And so he had mined some Bitcoin, so he had some Bitcoin. But then in the early 2000s, he had cleared out his house and thrown out the laptop that included all of his passwords. Private keys are what they're referred to, what they're called in the Bitcoin world. But basically, they're passwords. They allow you access to your account. They allow you to send money in Bitcoin around the world. He had lost it. He had 7,500 Bitcoin, which today would be worth about $240 million. And he doesn't know where it is, and he cannot get it back. There is no, right, you can't go and reset your password in the way you can reset your password with Google or Apple. It's just simply lost. And he's gone about for the last 5 or 6 years. He's been petitioning the local government to see if he can dredge all the local landfills to see if he can find his lost laptops. And so far, they have not allowed him to do it. So he's out $240 million, and there's nobody that he can go to for help. So yeah, so that's one of the big downsides, right? If you make a mistake, if something bad happens to you, there are fewer places you can go for help.
Yeah, that frightens me. And to kind of pull out some of that thread about security. So I will be honest that how I know about Bitcoin is that I have watched some documentaries and probably like a Dateline or something like that talks about like the Silk Road. So black market, dark web. Can you talk about what makes this type of currency popular with people with possible nefarious intentions? And do you think that's the exception or the rule?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That is the way that many people first come across Bitcoin, at least in the, for the first 5 years, particularly. They came across it because they heard about these dark net sites that allow you to buy drugs. And Silk Road is maybe the biggest one. So it may be helpful just to talk a little bit about Silk Road, what happened there. It's a fascinating story. So Silk Road was an anonymous marketplace that was like a darknet version of Amazon. You could buy pretty much everything. And anybody could list their own goods on it. It was launched in February 2011. It was run by a man who called himself Dread Pirate Roberts, named after the character from the movie The Princess Bride. And it could only be accessed using an encrypted browser called Tor. It's very popular on the dark web. And it had a particularly pronounced focus on illegal goods, primarily drugs. So the its own website counted that it was selling marijuana, hash, shrooms, LSD, ecstasy, DMT, mescaline, and more. It also had categories for counterfeit bills, firearms, ammunition, and hitmen. So these were the kinds of things that it was selling. The website Gawker ran an article about it in 2011, calling it the underground website where you can buy any drug imaginable. And they went in and actually took a look at what all these things were going for on the website. So it immediately went viral as soon as Gawker ran it. And quickly, newspapers were reporting about the sort of the wild west that was the world of virtual currencies like Bitcoin. Senators were talking about it and condemning it. And the FBI ended up launching an investigation. And it took them a couple years, but they eventually found the Dread Pirate Roberts. He was actually an Eagle Scout from Austin, Texas, surprisingly. And but they ended up arresting him, and he's in jail now. But in a twist that sort of rivals a Hollywood movie, it turns out that the guys who were investigating, the FBI, themselves, a couple of the rogue FBI agents themselves secretly they were impersonating somebody else. They went to Dread Pirate Roberts and they said, unless you give us a lot of money, we're going to tell the feds. We think the feds are onto you, and we'll tell them who you are. And so they started extorting him. They ended up getting about $8 million out of the Dread Pirate Roberts while they were members of this team, this FBI team investigating him. Eventually they were found out and they were sent to jail after they were convicted. But just before they were sent to jail, one of them had managed to write down the passwords for all of the Dread Pirate Roberts Bitcoin accounts. And he then sent all the money to another account so that he could use it when he eventually got out of jail. They also caught him in that, so he got more time in jail. But so this is sort of the sort of Hollywood type plots of the Bitcoin world. Now, why is it that everybody's using Bitcoin for these illegal criminal activities? Well, it starts with the structure, right? So the structure of Bitcoin is such that nobody is operating with their real names. Everybody has a public address, which is a little bit like a bank account, but it doesn't have anybody's name attached to it. It's just a random string of letters and numbers. It's not connected to anybody in the real world. So that provides a level of anonymity. It's not perfect anonymity because everybody knows that the public can access the blockchain and can actually see how much Bitcoin is in each address. So it's not perfect anonymity, but it provides a level of anonymity that maybe a typical bank does not provide. But I also think another part of the reason why it's so popular with the underworld is that who are the people who are drawn to anonymous online currencies? Well, it's people who have some suspicion about the authority figures, right? They're people who maybe are a little bit less likely to comply with the rules of governments and local governments and taxing authorities. And so I think there's also a sociological element to who are the people who are drawn to this currency. Just as a practical matter, there have been studies done on this. There was a 2018 study that analyzed all the transactions from Bitcoin and found that about 50% of transactions were associated with illegal activity. So that seems like a pretty high level of criminality on it. It's obviously debated by others that so many people they could possibly be just criminals. Increasingly, it's about investment and speculation about where the price will go. But criminality is certainly an aspect of it.
So I think that speculation part is really interesting because I know it was in the book, and I remember watching a documentary that talked about the Mount Gox.
Mount Gox, yep. Yeah.
And the how he kind of like a thief in the night ran away with everyone's money, right? And it is kind of like playing the lottery with whether or not it's going to go up or down, right? Because it's totally dependent on how many other people are willing to trust it and put money in it. Correct?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, that is one of the most fun parts of researching this book was researching sort of the origins and ideas behind money and value, right? And I think you're 100% right. I mean, the only reason why Bitcoin has value is because somebody else thinks it has value, right? If I were the only one who thought it had value, then it wouldn't be of value to anybody, to me, because nobody else would accept it. And so Satoshi realized that as well. And so he spent a lot of time, Satoshi Nakamoto, the founder, he spent a lot of time proselytizing for it, saying, look, here's all these benefits, right? If you don't want the federal government inflating away value, well, I've got this Bitcoin that will never inflate away value. If you don't want big companies snooping on what you're buying, well, I've got this Bitcoin that won't allow people to snoop on what you're buying, right? So he provides a lot of time proselytizing. Now, of course, what's the distinction between Bitcoin and, say, dollars on that aspect, right? Is what if all of a sudden tomorrow everybody thought that dollars were worthless? Would they be worth anything? Now, of course, one of the big distinctions here that sort of the theories of money say is that unlike, say, virtual currency that has no sort of physical component, at least dollars have this backstop in that you know that the federal government will accept it to pay for your taxes, right? So the federal government has to accept your dollars for taxes. But beyond that, really, there's not much of a backstop for the dollar if people stopped believing in it. So it very much is a shell game in the end, except that obviously there are an entire world financial system based around regular currencies. There are not world systems based around digital currencies. So I think that's part of the problem with the Bitcoin system, is it simply doesn't have either the use cases or the backing of a centralized authority that will allow it to be used for sort of ultimate payment systems. So those are the big problems with it, and it's never really overcome that. It's never turned into a really into a payment system. It's primarily being driven by, right, partially this criminal underbelly, but then also speculation about how much is it going to be worth tomorrow.
So, and this makes me think about centralization versus decentralization, right? Can you talk about what's different between those two? And I guess you would say, obviously, like the United States Treasury is a centralized form of currency as opposed to Bitcoin, which is decentralized.
Yeah, so that's one of the core focuses of the book is trying to highlight what is unique about Bitcoin and what is common with Bitcoin and other large systems like governments, economies, the financial system. And at the end of the day, all of these have this basic problem of how much power do you want to have in the hands of the centralized administrative figure, and how much power do you want to have in the hands of the people, the masses, individuals, small groups. Bitcoin has decided heavily in favor, or at least it's designed to heavily favor putting all decisions and power within the users themselves, right? So what is this reminiscent of in the government world, right, is democracies, right? You're supposed to have in a democracy people having a vote to choose who their representatives are, or maybe even on actual policies. And so we haven't had a lot of thinking about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin might work and why it might be better or worse from a decentralization standpoint. We've had a lot of thinking about decentralization versus centralization in the world of political philosophy, right? This is the basic problem of political philosophy, right? What is the best system? Is it a monarchy with just an individual head? Or is it democracy with everybody participating? And so I spent a good amount of time in the book talking about sort of the development of political philosophy. It starts, like everything does, with Plato, right? And so Plato, what he had to say about ancient Greek philosopher, he said that democracy, he was a bit disdainful of democracy. In fact, when you read it, he was much more critical of it than we would be today. But it was because he thought of it as leading to chaos. Right? So the way he described democracy is that it would be an agreeable kind of regime. It would be anarchic, it would be colorful, and it would grant equality to equals and unequals alike. And of course, one of the key takeaways from that is that it grants equals and unequals the same power. And that's the same system that we have in Bitcoin, right? You have everybody, regardless of how virtuous they are, or regardless of whether they're mobsters or regular people, your average Joes, they have the same ability both to use the system, to hide in the system, but also to help run it. So it turns out that there's an aspect that we haven't talked about a lot today and has gotten less attention recently. But one of the big drawbacks of the Bitcoin system and blockchain more generally is that it takes a lot of energy to drive it. The way that you earn Bitcoin and the way that the Bitcoin system is maintained is by computers solving very difficult math problems in order to prove that the system was verified as the person actually had the right amount of money that they're trying to send. That requires a lot of money and a lot of energy. And what's more, the system itself is designed so that the amount of energy that is required to create new Bitcoin increases over time. So that's a really bad system from the perspective of efficiency, because we are basically incentivizing computers taking up energy. So there was a study that came out a few years ago that said that the amount of energy that is being used currently by Bitcoin is the same as the amount of energy that is being used by the country of Ireland. Right? So this Bitcoin that's not being used for that many actual real world transactions is using up the same amount of energy as the entire country of Ireland. That's a really bad problem that's being driven by a relatively small amount of economic activity. So that's one of the big drawbacks I think of decentralized systems, is that they just simply aren't very efficient, right? If you could have one person who just says, yes, that person has the money, send the money, I'll make an entry into my my bank account. That's a lot more efficient than saying, okay, let's check with every person in the world to decide whether or not that person has the money in their bank account. And that's effectively what Bitcoin does. Now, the upside, of course, is what happens if you don't think the centralized authority figure is a good one? What if you don't trust them? What if you think that they're a tyrant? What if you think they're going to inflate away all your money? If those are your primary concerns, then decentralization starts to look better. And so in the United States, right, we have a pretty good financial system. It does occasionally have financial crises that melt down the entire economy. But for the most part, that doesn't happen every day. That's not always the case in all countries, right? There's lots of countries where there's rampant inflation, there's hyperinflation. People don't trust banks to be able to transfer their money out of the country. So in those scenarios, Bitcoin and decentralized currencies start to look more attractive, right? If you think that the centralized authority figure isn't a good one, we can't trust them, then maybe you go to a system that's decentralized and we don't have to go to that centralized authority figure ever again. So I think those are some of the major pros and cons of sort of a democratized system versus a monarchical system.
Well, and as I was reading it, I was really thinking a lot about how, like, part of the reason why we have a central bank is because at one time states made their own money, right? And some states were not as careful about it as other states. And there was some time before we had that central bank that, like, there were some places that they wouldn't take, say they wouldn't take Delaware's money, or right, or they wouldn't take Massachusetts money because it was essentially worthless paper, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's entirely the case. And so that's part of the reason why, or that was one of the justifications for Bitcoin, was let's have a system where we won't ask you who you are. We won't ask you how you got your money. We won't comply with anti-money laundering laws. We'll just let the transaction occur if you want it to occur.
What do you think the efficacy of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency will be in the future?
That's a great question. So I'll start with Bitcoin, then we can turn to cryptocurrencies and maybe blockchain. So Bitcoin, there's been an enormous amount of investment in it in the last few months. I mean, it shot up for a very long time. It was sitting around $6,000 per Bitcoin. Now it's at $32,000 per Bitcoin. So that's a huge percentage increase in just a year. So it's had a lot of investment. At the same time, it's never really broken through as a payment system, right? The whole idea about a currency normally is that you can use it to buy things, not really being used to buy things. It's maybe making more online payment processors are allowing it to be used, but it's really not being used on a regular basis. So unless I don't see anything major changing on that front, it will be able to be one of the more common justifications now is to say, we're not going to use it for a payment system. What we are going to use it for is as a hedge. We're going to hedge against other asset classes, right? It does seem that Bitcoin doesn't go up and down at the same rate as the stock market. It doesn't seem to be connected closely with, say, real estate, right? It seems to be this sort of independent thing that goes on its own directions. And from basic portfolio diversification theory, maybe it's a good idea to buy some of an asset that isn't correlated with other assets. So that might be one use case for it.
I was just going to say, so something you've said is something that I've been trying to figure out all along is what do you do with it? How do you, right? So like that guy who's lost the laptop and so he's lost billions of dollars, but how could he use those billions of dollars? This is the thing that I have not been able to wrap my head around.
Yeah, so that's a great question. How do you actually use it at the end of the day? So I'll tell a story about this because I tried to do exactly this. Was what am I going to do with this when I buy some? So my idea for the book, and I just actually didn't make it into the book, but it was a fun experiment nonetheless. My idea for the book was, wouldn't it be fun if I could buy a cup of espresso using Bitcoin? And so I said, okay, so first of all, I need to Google a list of all the coffee shops in my area that accept Bitcoin. So Google managed to send me to some website that purports to list all the places in the neighborhood that accept Bitcoin. So I started calling them up, and one after another, they said, no, I've never heard of Bitcoin. I do not accept it. So I went down those lists. So obviously this website is completely out of date. It's not accurate. Most of the places have either shut or it was some experiment that they haven't done for years. Eventually, I managed to talk to a manager at a Vietnamese coffee shop down the road, a Vietnamese restaurant. And he said, well, we don't accept Bitcoin, but our payment processor does. So if you use our online ordering system, then you can buy not an espresso, but a Vietnamese coffee. So then I said, okay, so great. So now I know where I'm going to buy my coffee from. Next step is get the Bitcoin and spend it. That also is not particularly easy. The big player here is a company called Coinbase, and it allows you can go to their website and actually buy Bitcoin from them. It's what's called a cryptocurrency exchange. So I went there and I had to open up an account. Now, of course, to open up an account, turns out that's a long process as well. It's not a day venture. It ended up taking me about 2 weeks to get my account because I had to send in money from my regular bank account to their website. And then once I got it into their website, then I got to buy some Bitcoin. Each one of those steps, there's a fee. Each one of those steps, there's time. Turns out the Coinbase, while you can buy Bitcoin there, you can't actually spend Bitcoin there. So you then have to open up a wallet account with a separate provider. And then you have to send the Bitcoin from the Coinbase account to the wallet provider. That's also fees. That's also more days. But eventually I got that done, managed to get it into my wallet. It was spendable. I had $20 of Bitcoin. I sent it in. I managed to order the Vietnamese coffee. It was delicious. I picked it up that afternoon, but it did take me 2 days. It cost me about $13, and I could have just bought it with my Capital One credit card for $7. So it gives you a little bit of the sense of just how far you have to go to use it. It's not an easy system, but that's what you would have to do if you wanted to use it on a regular basis.
That seems like a lot of work.
Yeah. The other interesting thing is tax. So for a long time, people didn't really know how Bitcoin would be taxed. What was it? How it classified under the tax system? So the IRS in I think mid 2000 teens, they did a study and they found that only 12 people in all of the United States had reported gains from Bitcoin. And of course, this was a time when Bitcoin had gone from 1 cent to $20,000. And there were only 12 people in the United States who had reported a gain from their Bitcoin. They thought, that doesn't seem right. There's got to be more people out there who've made money on this. So they ended up having to subpoena Coinbase, the cryptocurrency exchange, and a bunch of people had to pay fines because of this, because they were avoiding their taxes. So that's yet another problem with the system.
So that kind of leads me into our next question. Can you talk about the issues and discussions about how governments are dealing with cryptocurrency, security, things like security regulation, law enforcement, taxes, laws in general?
Sure. Yeah. No. That's as a law professor, that's the stuff that I get most excited about. So, how does the legal system respond to these new technologies as they get created? So, there's some things where there's just a simple answer, and the problem is that factually it's hard to enforce. Right. So, what happens when somebody steals Bitcoin from somebody else? The legal answer is pretty easy, right? That was theft. The person committed a crime. The problem is, how do you go about enforcing this legal rule against theft when it's an anonymous currency? And so law enforcement is having to find new ways to do that. It turns out that because these public addresses are public, and so wallets are public, there are ways to track Bitcoin. It turns out to be not quite as anonymous as we think. So, but it still requires more than just, say, looking at the videotape in the bank, right? So there's new things where the law is clear, but it's just sort of unclear how we go about enforcing it. But there's other things where actually it's unclear what the law is. So take, for example, you mentioned securities law. That's one of the bread and butter pieces for any corporate lawyer. Securities laws are laws that regulate the sale of stock. When you sell stock in a company, like in an initial public offering, an IPO, you have to register it with the Securities and Exchange Commission and provide all this information to them. That takes a lot of money, costs a lot. But the idea is, let's protect investors. Let's make sure that investors aren't being bilked. But if you sell a cryptocurrency to the public, do those same laws apply to it? And that's harder, right? It's unclear whether a cryptocurrency counts as a stock. It doesn't sound like a stock because it's a currency, but actually most people think that it isn't a currency. Instead, it's some strange version of a contract versus an investment versus maybe a little bit of that aspect of a commodity. So there's all of these potential regimes that come into play, and it's unclear which one of them applies. And so courts and regulators are trying to catch up. They're largely now, they have a system, but it's being challenged in court. So the Securities Exchange Commission says that most sales of most sales of cryptocurrencies are sales of stock because they are investments in a centralized system, and there's profits that are expected. I don't know the efforts of others. This is something, a test that was created back in the 1917 by the Supreme Court. So they say, look, most of these things that are being sold are actually stock, and so you should be registering them with the SEC. And so there are some major cases out there that are now being challenged in court about whether or not somebody has violated the securities laws. So we just don't know what the answer is going to be when it goes all its way through the court. But for now, there's a lot of open questions.
So, and I want to remind our listeners that if you have questions, post them in the chat. And I kind of building on that government thing, one of the things you talked about in the book is that there is an island government that's using blockchain, right, to run their government. So what are the potential ways that blockchain could be used in our regular lives outside of the Bitcoin cryptocurrency aspect of it?
Great. Yeah. So this is something that I think probably has more promise than most of the cryptocurrency type applications of blockchain, right? So Bitcoin is just one application of this basic technology called blockchain. But blockchain has many other uses, right? At its most basic, blockchain is simply a decentralized way of keeping track of information. That's remarkably flexible, and it can be used in all these other ways. So, for example, there's a company called Minds. And many of them actually are based on real-world examples of technology that maybe have fallen, the companies have been criticized. So take Facebook, right, the social media app. Now there's a blockchain-based version of Facebook called Minds, and it's supposed to be using decentralized systems to create a social media network. And that way you don't have to worry about getting banned by Facebook. There's a blockchain-based version of YouTube called LBRY, which I assume is pronounced library. And there you can store online content like videos. And that way you don't have to worry about getting banned by YouTube. But then there's other ways that are maybe a little bit behind the scenes. So Walmart has experimented with using blockchain to keep track of where its spinach and lettuce goes from and to, and in order to make sure it doesn't get contaminated, right? These supply chains. Other people are looking into whether you can use blockchain to make our stock exchanges run more efficiently. So there's all these sort of back office type deals that are less exciting, a little bit more boring, but maybe have more application, more likelihood of application than sort of the flashy Bitcoins of the world.
What do you think is the most important thing to take away from the book?
So for me, one of the broader lessons that I took away from the book, because I do think that who knows where Bitcoin is going to go, but it is under any metric, it is a remarkable effort by a small group of people to create something out of nothing and turn into a worldwide phenomenon, right? You can count on the list of maybe two hands, the companies that have done similar things in the last 10 years, right? So what are some of the broader lessons we can learn about these efforts? So I think one is, right, a lesson about what happens when technologies that are built on the computer, they run into the stubborn realities of the real world, right? Law and markets and human nature. Satoshi Nakamoto, when he first created this Bitcoin, he thought of it as being a way to create a sort of a digital utopia where everyone would be free and everyone would be empowered. There wouldn't be these single institutions that would be controlling all of our fates. But that is not the way that Bitcoin has turned out, right? It's become this haven for drug dealers and hackers. It's being dominated by a few mining companies over in China. So it's not really the sort of democratic utopian ideal that we have. And I think that part of the reason why that was because they simply didn't think long-term about some of the biases and the tendencies of the world that they were unleashing this technology into. And I think those lessons, right, apply much more broadly than the Bitcoin. I mean, you just think about what's going on at Facebook nowadays. I think that
it's just what I was thinking about. Social media in general.
Social media in general, right? They created this thing, and even the most imaginative of us could hardly have imagined what would come out of it. And so that's a lesson. I think that it is likely that these efforts that we make and we design on our computers are going to change in the hands of the market. So we need to keep an eye on, we need to have more than an eye. We need to think heavily about what the tendencies are of these markets. I think another key takeaway, right, is that there's this really deep and ingrained belief that we can use technology to save ourselves from ourselves, right? The people who are like the cypherpunks and Satoshi Nakamoto and all these followers on Reddit, they really, they're utopian. They believe in this system and they think that somehow they can create a technological world that will solve all these problems from the real world, right? These corrupt politicians, these greedy corporations, all these companies that are violating our privacy, right? But in the end, they ended up just replicating those problems in a new arena. And in a new arena where we just didn't have the same safety mechanisms that had been developed in the old arenas, right? In democracies, we have checks and balances. We don't have those same kinds of checks and balances in the Bitcoin and blockchain world. In businesses, right, you can sue them. There's fiduciary duty rules. None of those things apply in the Bitcoin and the blockchain world, or at least not clearly. And so my hope is that we'll keep having this belief in the ability of technology to save ourselves, but also that we'll put more effort into saving ourselves in the real world rather than putting off those questions to the technology.
Well, I think the bottom line is even if you're trying to use technology to solve things, right? People are still people, and people are still involved with the technology. So this seems to be like a lot of people who haven't read enough science fiction.
Exactly. There's always a flaw. Even if there's not a flaw in the system, the flaw is us, right? That is very much it. I mean, even it goes even to this just to return it to a slightly more boring topic. Even the idea about supply chains, right? The idea that blockchain is going to solve us from these supply chains is, yeah, you can create a secure record, but it all depends on the person who's putting the secure record in there, right? If you have the password, you can send that information. You don't know if that information is actually accurate in the real world, but all you know is, well, they have a password, they sent this information, I'm going to transmit it, right? So it depends heavily on real people in the real world and their motivations.
So we kind of talked about this at the beginning, that I was going to ask you about this. So I think kind of this whole interesting thing about, is Bitcoin a security? Is it not? It's kind of this group thing. Let's kind of talk about what's happening this week with GameStop stock and AMC and Reddit, since you mentioned that as well. And this whole, I don't like that people are using the word gamification of the stock market. But I guess in some ways it kind of is the gamification of stock market. And kind of for me, that seems really relevant and related to kind of how Bitcoin works as well in some ways.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating case. It sort of came out of nowhere. I had no idea this was a phenomenon. I had no idea that the masses had this kind of power. So it's sort of amazing. So the basic background to this, right, is that a few days ago, there were a couple websites, Reddit, maybe 4chan as well. They started to push up the price. They would start chatting about pushing up the price of a company called GameStop, which sells video games mainly in the physical world. They don't have a big online presence, so it's sort of this relic from the 2000s.
And they're actually based here in DFW.
Oh, all right. Well, not a relic then. Cutting edge. But so they had their stock was trading at a pretty low number, and then all these people on Reddit said, "Let's buy it and push it up." And they were driven, at least partially. Part of it, I think, frankly, was just because they thought it'd be funny. But another part of it seemed to be that they wanted to. There had been news that a bunch of hedge funds had shorted the stock and wanted the stock to go down. And so they thought, okay, this will be a great way to stick it to the man, stick it to the hedge funds. We're going to shoot the price of this GameStop up, and that'll really teach them. And they did. I mean, it's gone up an enormous percent in just a day. They had to
say that the percentage I heard today on the news was 17,000.
Amazing. Yeah, that's even higher than I'd heard. So yeah, so it's gone up really, really high. I think the New York Stock Exchange had to put a freeze on its stock a couple of times. These circuit breakers. So it's a remarkable case. My takeaways from it, to be honest, I wanted to learn more about it. It's too early for me to have a takeaway, other than to think it's incredible that a few people could have this much power. I had no idea that. Who knows how many people are reading this Reddit webpage? I can go look at the subscribers to it, but I would not have thought that even a relatively large number of readers would have the capacity to push up a stock that high, but they did. So it's an amazing story.
And it's
power of the masses.
Right. So I don't know if you know that today they may have disabled that Reddit page, and they also. In addition to the breaks at the stock exchange, at least one of the trading apps that people have been using stopped allowing regular people to trade, but allowed the hedge funds to still continue to trade. And apparently somebody was on some hedge fund manager was on CNBC today screaming his head off about how they shouldn't be allowed to do these things. But what's really interesting about this to me is it's exactly what the hedge funds were doing, right? They were taking a bet that GameStop was going to eventually go out of, they were going to go out of business. And so they were taking bets on how low they could get the stock to get. And they kind of got beat at their own game.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I had not made that connection before, but you're right. I mean, there is a way, right? A great instance of precisely the worries that sort of Satoshi Nakamoto and all the Bitcoin people have, right? Is that at the end of the day, if you're going through a large institution, Robinhood, I think is the app. If you're going through a large institution, then you have to play by their rules, and maybe their rules might favor the powerful and the big and the other large financial institutions at the expense of the little man. And so I hadn't thought about that, but that's a wonderful connection. And I think you're right. I think it does show some of the downsides to it.
Well, and I think the other thing I heard today was that they had shorted that stock so much that they'd actually shorted it more than there were shares of stock. So now they've lost billions of dollars.
Wow. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go read up more about it, because it sounds like there's a book to be written about that.
But it kind of just made me think about, the whole why we're kind of using Bitcoin to trade, right? We don't want one particular person or group to be able to control how it works, right? So I just thought it was very timely that all of that was happening the same week that we were gonna kind of talk about this sort of topic. So
well, yeah, I'm gonna have to go look up what Robinhood's justification was. I'd be curious to see how they went about it.
Yeah, something about fiduciary duty, but they've already been sued, and I think they've already reinstated.
Oh,
yeah. As of like the 7 o'clock news. Yeah. So,
we were talking in my mergers and acquisitions class this morning precisely about this case and what the potential charges could be related to it. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about what does shorting mean, and all of that. So I think it's really interesting when crazy stuff happens that makes you kind of like step back and say, oh, I think maybe I need to understand more about how this thing works in general, and whether or not we need to talk about whether how it works in general is a good thing or a bad thing.
Yep. I totally agree. And that was part of the reason why I wrote the book, was to say, let's take a step back from the immediacy of this problem and think, what are the broader principles at play here?
Yeah, I think for me, it was really interesting to read it because, again, the only thing that I really knew about it was the Silk Road drug thing and the hitman, right? There was a whole story about somebody hiring a hitman on the Silk Road and then somebody almost dying. And so it was really interesting for me to kind of get a second look at it, right? Yeah.
It was actually Dread Pirate Roberts who hired a hitman. It's an incredible, really every element of that aspect of that story is sort of unbelievable.
Yeah, and I know there's at least one Dateline episode for anybody who's listening who wants to look it up. And I also think there's at least one documentary on Netflix that may or may not include the Silk Road stuff that talks about Bitcoin, because I know I've watched it, and that's got to be the only place that I could have watched it. So, and it was a while ago, but I'm sure it's still there because they generally don't remove their documentaries. So, yeah. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions from anybody, I'm going to give us another minute, and then if not, we'll just wrap it up. Is there anything else that you think we should say about Bitcoin?
I don't think so. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, Jennifer, and thank you to the Fort Worth Public Library for having me. It's been an honor.
Well, and we really appreciate you coming today, and we want to thank everybody else for joining us. And if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, we have made arrangements with the Dock, which is our local independent bookstore here in Fort Worth. And I have on the screen their contact information. You can order it via their website. You can give them a call. I do believe that they are open now, but with some limited hours. So I would definitely check out their website first. And if you are participating in the Winter Bean Stack Challenge, this is the last week for it, you can use the code READ21 to record your participation in today's event. And then we hope you come back for another author visit with us. We have almost one a week between now and April. So visit our website, fortworthlibrary.org, and check out our calendar for information on upcoming events. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a great evening.